February 19, 1944. Inside a command post deep underground in Rabaul, New Britain, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's hand shook a little as he wrote in his personal diary. He was putting down words that would have gotten him in serious trouble if his superiors ever found them. "The Americans are not fighting us," he wrote. "They are choking us. Each skipped-over base is another anchor pulling the Empire down to the bottom of the sea. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from." Through a small air vent, he could make out the far-off sound of B-24 Liberator bombers, a daily bombing run that had become as dependable as the morning sun since the Americans decided Rabaul wasn't worth taking. 100,000 Japanese soldiers, the best of the Imperial Army and Navy, were stuck on this volcanic island, doing nothing as American ships sailed past them on their way to Japan. The once great fortress of Rabaul, which had been turned into a huge naval base and the most heavily guarded Japanese spot in the South Pacific, was being slowly made useless without a single invasion. What Kusaka was seeing, and what scared him more than any wild charge or naval attack, was a new kind of war that made Japan's way of defending completely outdated. The Americans weren't following the old warrior code. They weren't looking for an honorable fight. They were carefully taking apart the Japanese Empire through planned ignoring, making strong points weak, and turning forts into jails. The numbers of their loss were not being written in lists of the dead and wounded, but in cargo lists for ships that would never show up, on airfields that would never see another Zero takeoff. They were being written in the fate of soldiers who would die not from American bullets but from sickness, hunger, and being forgotten. The Japanese defensive plan in the Pacific had been created in the offices of the Imperial General Headquarters, with a perfect logic that appealed to military leaders. Each island fort would be a permanent base for planes, each group of soldiers a sword aimed at the American approach. The enemy would have to attack these spots, losing many men against Japanese strength and spirit. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo himself had announced in September 1943 the creation of a final line of defense for the nation, a protective border that included the southern part of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, the Bonin Islands, the Marianas, Western New Guinea, Malaya, and Burma. Every strong point was to be held until the last soldier. Every island would be made into a fortress. The Americans would have to spill blood for every foot of land. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura was in charge of 50,000 top soldiers of the 8th Area Army. The port was filled with 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 airfields were ready to send out hundreds of planes. The setup included pre-war Australian airstrips at Lakunai and Vunakanau, with Rapopo running since December 1942 with concrete runways and large repair shops, and Tabera finished in August 1943. Miles of tunnels deep underground linked defensive areas, hospitals and supply caches dug out of the volcanic rock. Rabaul is unbeatable. Imamura had sent in a message to Tokyo in November 1943, "The Americans will break themselves on our defenses like waves hitting a rock wall." What neither Imamura nor the headquarters in Tokyo realized was that the Americans didn't plan on giving them the big fight they wanted. The truth started to show itself in June 1943, though it looked like a win at first. When American troops came ashore on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands on June 30th, Japanese leaders were happy at first. These islands had very few defenders. The Americans were obviously scared to attack real Japanese strongholds. Captain Toshio Takahashi, an intelligence officer at Rabaul, noted in his report, "The enemy doesn't have the courage for a real fight. They pick at the sides like mice afraid of the lion." But something bothered him about the way they were doing things. The Americans weren't just grabbing easy land. They were picking islands where they could build airfields. Woodlark and Kirawina were in the perfect spot to give air support for missions that had nothing to do with attacking Japanese bases nearby. The unease got worse when American troops landed on New Georgia on June 30th, 1943. The Japanese had 10,500 soldiers protecting the island, mostly around the crucial airfield at Munda Point. At last, a real fight. But after intense combat that went on until August, the Americans took the airfield and then just stopped. They didn't go after the Japanese soldiers who were pulling back. They didn't try to take over the whole island. They just built up Munda and kept going. Major Kenji Hatano, who made it through the New Georgia fight, told his superiors at Rabaul, "The Americans fight in a different way. They take what they need and let us have the rest. It's like we are not important to them." By November 1943, the pattern was becoming terrifyingly obvious. The American push, called Operation Cartwheel, wasn't about taking Japanese bases. It was about making them useless. Admiral Minichi Koga, the head of the combined fleet, had reacted to the Allied landing on Bougainville by sending carrier planes to Rabaul in a hurry. On November 1, 1943, he moved 173 carrier aircraft, 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 scout planes from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuiho, Junyo, Hio, and Ryuho to strengthen Rabaul. These were Japan's last well-trained carrier pilots. They were the priceless, experienced soldiers who had struck Pearl Harbor, hit the British hard at Ceylon, and battled at Midway. They were the very best of Japanese naval air power, now sent to protect a base the Americans had already chosen to skip. The American answer was quick and destructive. On November 5th, carrier planes from the USS Saratoga and USS Princeton hit Rabaul, badly damaging 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers. On November 11th, they came back with the Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence, damaging most of the ships that were left. But it was what they did next that started the mental breakdown of the Japanese leaders. The Americans didn't invade. They didn't press their attack. They just went away. After destroying 121 of the 173 carrier planes and 82 of the 193 crew members, Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who lived through the November fights, wrote in a letter found after the war, "We won. We pushed them back. So why does it feel like a loss? They hurt our ships, shot down our planes, and just sailed off. We can't go after them. We can't hit back. We can only wait for them to show up again." Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai, a top staff officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, started keeping very detailed notes of what the skip-over strategy really meant. His secret reports found after the war show a chilling step-by-step story of a slow choking of their strategy. November 1943. Rabaul gets 30,000 tons of supplies each month. Fuel is at 60%. There is enough ammunition for 6 months of fighting. December 1943. Supply ships have a harder time getting through. American submarines sink 2 ships for every one that makes it. Monthly supplies are down to 18,000 tons. January 1944. No ships have made it to Rabaul in 3 weeks. Only submarines are delivering supplies, just 2,000 tons this month. Fuel is at 30%. By February 1944, the Japanese High Command decided to stop sending fighters or bombers to Rabaul. They saw it was pointless to keep supplying a base that was cut off. The numbers were unstoppable. Without supplies, even the strongest fort becomes a jail. Captain Tamichi Hara, in charge of a destroyer group at Rabaul, had an impossible problem. He had enough fuel for maybe one big mission, but where could he go? The Americans had taken the Admiralty Islands in February 1944, completely surrounding Rabaul. Every path led to waters controlled by the enemy. "We are a navy that can't leave port," he wrote. "Warriors who cannot fight. We have become a show, keeping up the appearance of being a danger while the real war goes on without us." What the Americans had figured out, either through amazing planning or just good luck, was that the Japanese island bases could be beaten by the Pacific Ocean itself. Each island they skipped became an awful jungle where nature, sickness, and hunger did the job of army divisions. Dr. Shigeyuki Otaka, the head doctor at Rabaul, recorded the slow breakdown of their ability to fight. December 1943. Malaria cases are going up, but medical supplies are good. Quinine supply for 4 months. Fighting ability is at 85%. March 1944. 30% of the soldiers have malaria, dengue fever, or dysentery. Quinine is gone, using local tree bark as a replacement with little success. Fighting ability is at 60%. June 1944. Lack of food is now the main problem. Rice portions are down to 400 grams. Soldiers are eating jungle plants, many of which are poisonous. 17 men died from eating bad plants this month. Fighting ability is at 40%. The Americans had made time itself a weapon. Every day that went by made the Japanese bases weaker, while American forces got stronger, jumping from island to island, building airfields and ports, and creating a network for winning, while Japanese strongholds wasted away alone in the tropics. On Wake Island, skipped since October 1943, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara was in charge of about 4,000 Japanese soldiers, Once a key stop for flights across the Pacific, Wake had been made into a fortress full of cannons on the coast, anti-aircraft guns, and underground shelters. The Americans just paid it no mind. Sakaibara would be promoted to Rear Admiral in October 1944, but by that point his command was already pointless. Sakaibara's messages to Tokyo, sent with radio parts delivered by submarine, became more and more hopeless. November 1943. Enemy carrier planes hit our facilities. Waiting for the invasion force. All men are ready. January 1944, no invasion came. Enemy ships go by every week, too far for our cannons to reach. Please send instructions. April 1944. Food situation is dire. Fishing helps some, but not enough for the men. Many are showing signs of poor nutrition. When is help coming? On Wolei Atoll in the Caroline Islands, 6,426 Japanese soldiers under Major General Katsumi Kitamura felt a similar sense of being left behind. The Americans had taken nearby islands for airfields but let Wolei's soldiers fade away. Kitamura's diary, found after the war, tells the story of their minds falling apart. March 31, 1944. The enemy ship sailed by again today. Close enough to see with binoculars but out of our guns' range. They don't even think we're worth attacking. May 15, 1944. Got a radio message that all available troops are gathering for a major battle. We are not part of it. We have become forgotten soldiers. August 2, 1944. The men have started planting gardens. This is not what warriors do, but we must do it to survive. I worry we are turning into farmers instead of soldiers. The American carrier attacks that hit the skipped bases now and then had a purpose beyond just military harm. They were mental attacks meant to show the Japanese soldiers how powerless they were. At Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, about 27,000 soldiers in the 4th Fleet had built what experts thought was an unbeatable fortress. On February 17-18, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Group launched huge air attacks that destroyed over 250 planes, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 32 cargo ships adding up to 200,000 tons, and killed 4,500 Japanese men. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, in command at Truk, faced a leader's biggest fear: being pointless. His report to the combined fleet headquarters showed the mental toll. The American carriers came out of nowhere, hit us with tremendous power, and disappeared. We could not chase them. We could not fight back. We could only wait and fix the damage, knowing they will come back whenever they want. This isn't war. It's torture. The same thing happened all over the Pacific. Marcus Island, Palau, Yap. Each got a visit from American carriers, just enough to stop any real defensive planning, but never enough to give the Japanese commanders the honorable fight they wanted. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 was the most crushing proof of how well the island-hopping plan worked. When American troops landed on June 15, 1944, they came with tremendous power, over 300,000 men in more than 500 ships. But what scared the Japanese planners wasn't the attack on Saipan. It was all the fortresses they hadn't attacked. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, leading the defense of Saipan, got his final update on July 6, 1944, before his last Banzai charge. It listed the Empire's stuck armies. Truk, 27,000 soldiers cut off, no naval help possible. Rabaul, 100,000 soldiers cut off, now growing their own food. Wake, 4,000 soldiers cut off, living on fish. Marcus, 4,000 soldiers cut off, water running out. Wolei, 6,426 soldiers cut off, starvation near. Over 200,000 Japanese soldiers with thousands of tons of ammo, hundreds of planes, and strong defenses were helpless as the Americans pushed toward Japan. These weren't losses. They were worse. They were soldiers and weapons turned from strengths into problems. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi got to Iwo Jima in June 1944, he carried with him a completely new way of thinking that came from seeing the island-hopping campaign. He knew right away that Iwo Jima could not be saved. The Americans will definitely attack this Iwo Jima on their way to mainland Japan, and they will attack very soon. Unlike the leaders before him who planned to win, Kuribayashi planned for a loss that would cost the enemy the most. He had seen what happened to the skipped-over bases and understood the big picture perfectly. Instead of putting defenses on the beach to fight the landings head-on, he chose to defend from deep inside the island, giving orders to build 18 kilometers of tunnels and 5,000 cave hideouts under the island. In a letter to his wife that was delivered after he died, Kuribayashi laid out his plan. I am not fighting to win. That is not possible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a high price that they will hesitate before attacking Japan. Every Marine we kill here is one less who can attack our homeland. We are not defending Iwo Jima. We are defending Japan by dying here. This was a complete change in Japanese military strategy. Kuribayashi strictly forbade Banzai charges until the very end, seeing them as a waste of men, and told every soldier to fight as long as they could before they were killed. The island-hopping plan had shown Japanese leaders that a brave death was worthless if it didn't help achieve a larger goal. What Japanese leaders slowly figured out was that the Americans had changed how war was fought. The island-hopping plan wasn't just about skipping strong points. It was about making a new kind of military supply system that made old defenses useless. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, a staff officer who studied American actions, wrote a report that was hidden by the Imperial headquarters. The Americans don't take islands. They make bases that can move. Every captured atoll turns into a fuel stop. Every lagoon an anchorage. Every airstrip a way to show their strength. They have turned the Pacific Ocean itself into a road for their war machine. The Liberty ships were being built at a rate of 3 per day at their fastest. While Japanese bases carefully saved their last bags of rice, American construction crews were pouring concrete for runways big enough for 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant planner behind the Pearl Harbor attack, looked at American supply lines from his post in Tokyo and came to a frightening realization. We got ready for a war of warriors. They are fighting a war of engineers. While we mastered the skill of dying, they mastered the skill of supplying. Every skipped-over base makes us weaker. Every new airfield makes them stronger. Time itself is now our enemy. Adding to the island-hopping plan was the American submarine war that made Japanese supply runs into missions with no hope of return. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than they could be built. Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, in charge of submarine actions from Truk, noted how impossible it was to support the bypassed bases. January 1944. Lost I-169 trying to bring supplies to the Bougainville base. 40 tons of supplies gone. February 1944. I-43 damaged by a plane near Rabaul. Mission called off. March 1944. I-42 sunk trying to get key people off Wake Island. April 1944. Submarine supply missions are stopped for now. Cannot risk losing boats for such small deliveries. The submarines that were once the only hope for the skipped bases became too valuable to lose. Each cut-off fort was now completely on its own. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 showed the deadly results of the island-hopping plan on Japanese naval air power. Japan had already lost 121 of its 173 expert carrier pilots defending Rabaul, which took away the carrier fleet's best flyers. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa leading the mobile fleet was in an impossible spot. His carriers were full of new pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flying time. The expert teachers who should have trained them were either dead or stuck on the bypassed islands. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19th, 20th, 1944. Japanese losses: 550 to 645 planes destroyed, 3 fleet carriers sunk, Taiho Shokaku Hyo. About 3,000 men killed. American losses: 123 planes, 109 killed. The 10-to-1 kill difference showed not just that America was better, but that Japan had been weakened by the bypass strategy. In his report after the battle, Ozawa wrote, "We have carriers with no pilots, pilots with no experience and no chance to get experience. The enemy's plan has not just beaten us, it has made it impossible for us to ever be able to win." By the middle of 1944, a strange change was happening in the bypassed Japanese bases. Top fighting units that had trained for years in the art of war were turning into farming communities just trying to stay alive. On Rabaul, General Imamura gave orders that would have seemed crazy 2 years before. Starting now, all units will spend 50% of their daytime hours on growing food. Each soldier must grow 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit leaders will be judged on how much food they grow, not how ready they are to fight. Imamura commanded the planting of fields to gather food, knowing the Americans had decided to block them instead of attack. The fortress of Rabaul, made to threaten Allied actions across the Pacific, had turned into a huge prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto, leading an infantry unit, wrote in his diary, My samurai ancestors would cry to see us. We who were trained to die with honor in battle now take care of sweet potatoes and raise chickens. The Americans have not just beaten us, they have shamed us by making us pointless. Similar things were happening all over the Pacific. On Wolaï, soldiers raised pigs. On Truk, they fished with makeshift nets. On Wake, they tried to grow vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had taken over half of Asia, was now just farming to survive. Perhaps the most brutal part of the island-hopping plan was that it took months or even years for the bypassed leaders to fully grasp their situation. They still had radio contact with Tokyo, orders were still sent, and promotions were still given. The lie that they still mattered in the war was kept up even as the reality was completely different. General Imamura at Rabaul was still getting operational commands from Imperial General Headquarters as late as December 1944. Get ready for a joint attack with the Philippine operations. Stay ready to stop enemy supply routes. The craziness of such orders, asking a base that hadn't seen a supply ship in 8 months to carry out attacks, shows the complete gap between what the Japanese high command thought and what was really happening on the battlefield. By April 1944, the last Japanese submarine had left Rabaul. The last ship had gone and no plane had flown in over a month. By early 1945, the bypass plan moved into its most brutal part. While there was no official mission to target gardens, American forces did sometimes bomb the farming efforts of the bypassed bases. B-24 bombers hit the gardens that the isolated soldiers had grown. Fighter planes shot up fishing boats. Even their attempts to live were taken away. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, the farming officer at Wolaï, wrote, 6 months of work gone in 10 minutes. The corn we grew from seeds, the vegetables we watered with our own drinking water, all of it is on fire. The Americans didn't bomb our guns or our ammo. They bombed our food. They know just what they are doing. When Emperor Hirohito declared Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, about 300,000 Japanese soldiers were still on the bypassed islands. At Rabaul alone, 69,000 Japanese troops were left when Japan gave up. These men had lived not by fighting, but by planting gardens, fishing, and slowly starving. The surrender led to a bizarre situation. Many bypassed bases didn't trust the surrender news, thinking it was American propaganda. Others, even if they believed it, had no way to surrender. They were on islands where there were no Americans. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto on Mili Atoll in the Marshall Islands faced this problem. The war is over, but we have no one to surrender to. The Americans skipped us so completely they forgot we were here. We have to wait for them to find us. Some bases waited for weeks or months before American forces came to take their surrender. During this period, they were in a strange state of waiting, no longer at war, but not yet in peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the planner of the Central Pacific Campaign, later thought about the island-hopping strategy. We found out that the fastest way to beat Japan was not to fight the Japanese. Every island we skipped meant thousands of soldiers we didn't have to kill, tons of ammo we didn't have to use, and American lives we didn't have to lose. We used their own strength against them. General Douglas MacArthur, who at first did not want to skip major targets, eventually saw how smart the plan was, especially after the choice to skip Rabaul saved a huge number of Allied lives. But maybe the most insightful judgment came from Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, who wrote in his diary in February 1945, "The Americans have found the perfect plan against the Japanese warrior spirit. They have made our bravery pointless, our forts useless, our warrior code meaningless. We got ready to die with honor. They sentenced us to live with shame. This is worse than being beaten. This is being wiped away." The numbers of the island-hopping strategy show its destructive success. Japanese forces bypassed Rabaul, 100,000 soldiers at first, 69,000 at surrender. Truk, about 27,000 soldiers. Wolaï, 426 soldiers, 650 lived to surrender. Wake, 4,000 soldiers. Marcus, 4,000 soldiers. Many other bases, tens of thousands more. In total, an estimated 300,000 Japanese soldiers were made useless without a big fight. Strategic success rate. Of the 26 main Japanese bases that were bypassed, none were able to seriously disrupt American actions after being cut off. The island-hopping strategy's biggest win wasn't in battle, but in the mind. It broke the basic ideas of Japanese military thinking. Japanese strategy was always about having one big battle, where their stronger spirit would win against fewer weapons and supplies. The Americans just wouldn't give them that battle. Japan had spent decades building up Pacific Islands. The Americans showed that forts only matter if someone decides to attack them. Japanese military culture praised death in battle. The Americans sentenced them to a life of being useless. Japanese belief said that a stronger will could beat a lack of supplies. The Americans made will itself unimportant. Captain Yoshitaka Hori, an intelligence officer on the bypassed Marcus Island, wrote the sharpest analysis. We were ready for American strength. We were ready for American technology. We were not ready for American indifference. They have found the one thing the Japanese warrior cannot fight: being ignored. By late 1944, some Japanese leaders started to understand and change to the new situation. But it was too late. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima had studied the island-hopping campaign and planned his defense based on it, not to win, but to make victory so expensive that Americans would think twice about invading Japan. His method: no banzai charges, no trying to hold the beaches, fighting from complex tunnel systems, was a total break from usual Japanese tactics. He had learned from the bypass strategy that the only thing a defensive spot was good for was the price it could make an attacker pay if they chose to attack it. The defense made the expected 5-day battle last for 36 days, causing nearly 26,000 American casualties with 6,121 killed. General Holland Smith called Kuribayashi the most formidable of all Pacific enemies. In the same way, the defense of Okinawa in 1945 showed that the Japanese had learned from island hopping. Instead of trying to stop the invasion, the defenders tried to make it so bloody that America would ask for a peace deal, rather than invade Japan. The greatest trick of the island-hopping strategy was that it used Japan's own commitment against itself. Every bypassed base that wouldn't surrender, every soldier who picked death over shame, every leader who followed orders to hold on at any price, became a prisoner of their own making. The Americans thought the bypassed bases would fall apart quickly, but many lasted much longer than expected by planting gardens and working with local people. This survival, which could be seen as brave strength, only made their suffering and pointlessness last longer. General Imamura, thinking back after the war, said, "We caught ourselves with our own code. Surrender was not an option. Retreat was not allowed, so we stayed. The Americans didn't have to beat us. We beat ourselves with our failure to change to their strategy." For the bypassed bases, the end of the war did not bring calm, but confusion. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka officially surrendered on September 6, 1945 on the HMS Glory. But they were surrendering soldiers that hadn't mattered in the war for over a year. Many smaller bases had even weirder endings. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers wouldn't believe the war was over and kept fighting an enemy that wasn't there until 1951. They kept military order, went on patrols, and got ready for an American invasion that had been called off 6 years before. These soldiers who kept fighting were the final outcome of the bypass strategy's mental impact. Their military purpose had been so completely canceled out that they couldn't imagine a world where they just didn't matter anymore. Beyond the big picture, the island-hopping strategy caused a special kind of terrible pain for the Japanese forces. Fighting, no matter how bad, at least had a purpose. Death for the emperor, a sacrifice for the country. The bypassed bases were not even given this small comfort. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at Wolei, wrote, "We do not fear death. We fear having no purpose. Every day we get up, do military drills for fights that will never happen, clean weapons that will never be fired, and act like we are soldiers when we are really prisoners of our own making." The medical files from bypassed bases show the cost in human lives. Lack of food affected 80% of soldiers. Sickness rates were over 60%. Mental problems were widespread. Suicide rates went up sharply compared to fighting units. The island-hopping strategy completely changed warfare in ways that went far beyond World War II. It showed that controlling key spots on a map didn't mean you controlled the area. Old military ideas were thrown out. The Americans proved you could control the Pacific while ignoring its strong points. The strategy showed that better supply lines and industry could beat any advantage in a fight. Time became a weapon. By speeding up their own actions while slowing down the enemy's, the Americans made the passing of time itself a strategic tool. Most of all, it proved that the mental impact could be greater than physical harm. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, former General Hitoshi Imamura released his life story. After being found guilty of war crimes, he had built a copy of his jail cell in his garden and stayed there until he died in 1968, giving all the money from his books to the families of Allied prisoners who had died under his command. His judgment of the island-hopping strategy was both professional and personal. We studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu. We prepared for every kind of war we could think of. But the Americans came up with a new kind we never thought of: warfare by not fighting, victory through being useless. They turned our biggest strength, our readiness to die for our posts, into our biggest weakness. At Rabaul, I led 100,000 of Japan's best soldiers. We had ammo for years of fighting, forts that could handle any attack, the will to fight to the last man. None of it made a difference. The Americans sailed right by us toward Japan, and we could do nothing but watch. We were an army of ghosts, haunting places that no longer mattered, protecting land that had no worth, waiting for fights that would never happen. This was their genius. They made us beat ourselves. Every day we held our positions, we made Japan weaker. Every soldier growing food at Rabaul was one not protecting the homeland. We were not beaten. We were erased. Future military leaders should look at the American island-hopping strategy, not for its smart tactics, but for its complete change in strategy. It proved that the best way to beat an enemy position is not to attack it, but to make it pointless. The best way to win a war is to change the meaning of winning itself. We scared ourselves with our own powerlessness. We had trained our whole lives for an honorable death in battle. The Americans sentenced us to a pointless life alone. There is no warrior code that gets you ready for being useless. We were warriors from an old way of life, fighting an enemy from the future. They did not beat our plan. They made plans themselves outdated. This was the real fear of the island-hopping campaign. It showed us that everything we thought we knew about war was wrong. The most touching story of the island-hopping strategy's mental impact came from Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who kept fighting on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, 29 years after the war was over, sent to Lubang on December 26, 1944, with orders to never surrender. Onoda stayed with 3 other soldiers until he was the only one left. On March 9, 1974, his old commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, flew to Lubang and officially told him his duty was over. Onoda surrendered on March 10, 1974, with his rifle still working, 500 bullets, and his 30-year-old uniform in good shape. When someone asked why he had kept on for so long, Onoda said, "I was waiting for the war to return to me. I never thought it would leave me behind forever." The Japanese were scared by America's island-hopping strategy because it meant something worse than defeat. It meant being meaningless. Every military tradition, every cultural belief, every strategic idea was used against them. They had gotten ready for a war of warriors and instead met a war of engineers and supply experts who treated their island forts like things to be driven around rather than enemies to be fought. About 300,000 Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands didn't just lose the war. They were written out of it. While they held their posts, grew their gardens, and slowly starved, the war went on without them. They were not defeated. They were thrown away. They were not beaten. They were ignored. In his last diary entry before Japan's surrender, Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul wrote, "The Americans have taught us the most brutal lesson of war, that there is something worse than dying in battle, being useless in victory. We were the Emperor's best warriors, forced to grow sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed past us to our homeland. We were ready to die with honor. Instead, we lived with no purpose. This was their greatest weapon. Not bombs or bullets, but being outdated itself. The island-hopping strategy worked because it didn't attack Japanese positions, but Japanese purpose. Not bodies, but beliefs. Not forts, but the basic ideas about what war even is. It turned the Pacific Ocean from a battlefield into a road to victory, and changed Japanese strongholds from fortresses into prisons they had built for themselves. The fear it caused came not from what it did, but from what it didn't do. It didn't give the Japanese warriors the fight they wanted. It didn't make their sacrifice valid. It didn't even notice they were there. It just went by them, letting them learn that the worst thing for a warrior isn't death, it's being irrelevant. The warriors of the Empire of the Rising Sun found out that the setting sun makes the longest shadows, and in those shadows, forgotten armies slowly disappeared into nothing, beaten not by their enemies, but by their absence. They had seen the future of war, and they had no place in it.